Again, thanks everyone for joining the event. We have a really great panel of civil servants, lawyers, technologists, designers who are doing amazing work in government around creating digital services, specifically forms, which are a major entry point into government services and the channel through which government collects a lot of data. And so I'm going to start out and just do an introduction and then ask the panelists to do their own introductions. My name's Sarah Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her. I'll do a quick land recognition. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge that Alabama, Coushatta, Caddo, Caruso, Comecrudo, Hulchan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan, Apache, Tonkawa, Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all of the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have been part of these lands and territories in Texas, where I'm virtually streaming from. I'm coming in, I'm a researcher for Beeck Center, looking at digital services, looking at all of the amazing work that's happening in government. And in addition to that, I also have worked for the city of Austin on paperless forms. And so I'm happy to have all of these amazing people on the panel talk about their work because I've learned from a lot of them. So I'm gonna kick it over to Honey, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and then Josh, Mayo, and Francis.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
We lose Honey. I can jump in while
Okay.
No problem. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Josh Key. My pronouns are he, him. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from the unceded territories of the Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie Nations, also known as Brooklyn sometimes. And I am at the MTA now, but previously and more relevant to this conversation, I was at the City of Boston digital services team where I worked on digital forms. And you'll all forgive me for saying the next sentence out loud, and I hate myself for saying it. I wrote a Medium post on forms that went kind of mini viral that maybe some of you have read about moving government forms online. So yeah, very excited to chat with all of you today.
Mayo, if you could introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining. My name is Mayo Nissen, pronouns he, him. I am the Design Lab Director in the New York City Mayor's Office of the Chief Technology Officer, which is a mouthful every time I say it. I'm joining this call from New York, Brooklyn. Also, as Josh mentioned, the ancestral lands of the Munsee, the Lenape. I'm also in a part of Brooklyn that's particularly strongly associated with the Mohawk people of the Kanawaki and Akwesasne in Quebec, who had a big wave of immigration in the early 20th century. So as the Design Lab Director in the Office of the CTO, my work is kind of a mix of human-centered research, understanding people, understanding how they see the world and what they need, and human-centered design, so designing things that make sense for them. Working in government, as Sarah said, forms are often a part of how people engage with the government one way or another. So it comes up often in our work as we work with our agency partners to help them achieve their missions. Who was next, Sarah?
Francis, if you would introduce yourself. I think we're still waiting on Honey. I think it's a connection issue.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Frances Ho. I'm happy to be here. I'm on a territory called Huichin, which is today what we call Berkeley, California. Huichin is the ancestral land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. I am an attorney with the Judicial Council of California, which was formerly known as the Administrative Office of the Courts. I think in many states it's referred to as AOC, policy-making body for the court system. I consider myself a forms geek. I love geeking out on forms. I work mainly in paper, but also some digital products, including our website, which is our statewide website. My area of specialty is domestic violence. So that is what I work on in terms of forms, restraining order applications. If you're a victim or survivor of intimate partner violence in California, you have to use one of our mandatory forms. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much.
And I think we had Honey rejoin. Honey, are you there?
I am. Apologies about that. Oh man, how mortifying. Hi, everybody. Hani Dacanay. My pronouns are she and her, and I am joining and have rejoined from the city of Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, Chippewa, and Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'm joining as the Executive Director of the Benefits Delivery Modernization branch of Service Canada, which is responsible for the Government of Canada's employment, insurance, and pension programs. And my main link to forms is that all of these things require pretty much all the access to different forms, and very interested in figuring out and hearing different ways to help solve this problem.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I was wondering if y'all could talk about sort of a form that you have either worked on or really enjoyed. I can share mine. At the City of Austin, there's a Parks and Recreation program called the Latino Artist Residency Program. And it's really an awesome program that works to bring in Latino artists to share their work with the larger community. But it also has the acronym LARP, which for those of you that are nerds like me, stands for live action role playing. So I would just, wondering if you could talk about a form that you've enjoyed or found really interesting or you've worked on. So I'll throw it over to the panel. Francis, do you want to start? It sounds like you are working on some really awesome forms.
Sure, I can start in that it's not a form, it's a piece of a form. So when you fill out a restraining order, the most important part of it is telling the court and the other side how you've been abused, right? Your grounds for a restraining order, and in other words, how you tell your story. And I think that's such a big component of a lot of court cases. And I think it's a real art when you're doing it in person. And so thinking about, having the conversation with another human being and what does that look like on a digital or a paper form. And so I think I could spend my career thinking about the best way to do that.
Thanks so much. Honey or Mayo or Josh?
I've got one. And so in my old job, it was a calculator / form for finding out, I guess, how much student aid students in Ontario are eligible for. And it was important because it was, we had learned that students normally do not consider pursuing a post-secondary education whenever they're applying. And it was because whenever they found out how much tuition would cost, it would drop out of the application process. And then there's also this fee that's part of processing the application. And so knowing how much they are eligible for helps anchor sort of and assuage a bunch of fears up front about how much post-secondary education is going to cost if they know how much aid they're eligible to receive.
Yeah, I would say one of my favorites, and I'll probably go into more about why I liked it so much later when we talk about data, but was the affordable housing lottery application in the city of Boston, where for those of you who have ever worked in affordable housing, a housing unit comes up and you have to apply. And I worked with the affordable housing department to traditionally had just been created by each real estate developer. So every form was different for every single housing unit, and it was all paper. And creating a standard web form that every single housing development used the same form was really exciting. And we'll talk about data later, but we'd also had some really big equity things I was super proud of.
I can jump in with a little bit of a different tack. Not a favorite form that I've worked on, but a piece of a form that I've had to fill in a couple of different times. As an immigrant to the US, you have many piles of paper to fill out. And I think just picking up on that idea of, forms are often a way to express identity within very rigid boxes. And I think it was the first form I had to fill out for the first time I came in as on a work visa. And the closest thing the lawyers could find and the options was commercial artist, which I just remember being kind of baffled by the mental image that brought to me of someone in the 20s silk screening posters, being like, that's not what I do, but never mind, sure, that'll do. and just kind of being amused by it, but also like, what do I do if they ask me questions about commercial art? That's not actually my area of expertise. And that kind of internal monologue that the form kind of prompted has kind of stuck with me over the years.
That's great. It's a really great stories about like that sort of like getting stuck or like that anxiety or that conflict, as well as like trying to tell your story. I'm really curious how all of you got involved in this work and working on digital services and forms. You know, maybe Josh, I know you looked at the entire city of Boston, so if you could talk a little bit about that. And same with you, Francis, too, working in the courts.
I slid into it a bit sideways. My background was digital marketing. So I had done a lot of work with email and driving people. And I was approached by the CIO of Boston, a guy named Yasha Franklin Hodge, who's like a tremendous human being in person, who was saying, we're bringing this team together. Would you want to come on board and work on help do some of that fancy digital marketing stuff? Like, why can't we do it so that we know where you are and you get a targeted email alert to register to vote when an election's coming up because you just moved and got a trash burn or whatever, and started, and there was no way to make landing pages or send email or do any data work. So I was like, okay, future me can do those things, and I will work on some other stuff. And the other half of the job was we have to move these forms. We have to try to digitize a lot of these forms as part of the website redesign. And you know, a lot of that, and I think a lot of my approach coming from marketing, where I just sort of called them like, well, they're just like really big landing pages. And so like, we just got to remove as many fields as possible so we can increase conversions, which maybe was like overly reductive, but I thought was not a terrible place to approach it to start. And and that's how I started to get more deep into the, like, you know, there wasn't even an archive of forms when I had started, right? It was just an old website with 10,000 PDFs, and they gave me, well, 6,700 PDFs or something, and having to look through all of those and figure out what is a form, what isn't, and start to find out more about that. But yeah, so very much slid into that. And then, you know, 2 years of doing that made me realize more about the forms.
Francis, Honey, Mayo, anyone want to take that question as well?
Sure, sir. I can go. Yeah, there are certainly plenty of opportunities to work on forms and digital products at the organization that I'm with. You know, in our court system, we have over 1,300 statewide forms. So we are in the business of creating forms. And many of the people that are creating forms are attorneys. They're subject matter experts and not necessarily form designers, right? And so I've really been interested in thinking about how we might change our process so that we can be more user-centered, that we are testing, prototyping, and how we get, you know, kind of just the people, our end users, as part of the policymaking process. And I've also been involved in working with our digital services team to create new web pages. You know, our web, we have just so much content, and that's the problem on our end, is that when legal problems, there's always an exception, right, to a rule. And how do you decide what information is suitable for web content for the average person, so as not to overwhelm them and scare them away from the process, and how to make the content more accessible. So I've been involved in just kind of, you know, redesigning and reframing our online content.
Awesome, thank you. And it sounds like there is sort of that front stage, backstage experience where it's not only, you know, the residents and people who are interacting with the forums, but also the employees and the subject matters. I'm wondering, you know, maybe Mayo and Francis, you could talk to the sort of the impact of digitizing forms and how that affects both the residents and people who are like taking in those forms every day. And Josh and Honey, feel free to jump in too.
Well, thing. Yeah, so I approach forms almost interestingly, kind of the opposite of the way, Francis, you just described, as a designer and not as a subject matter expert, typically, certainly not as a lawyer. And you know, the classic framing of that is being user-centered, where you kind of have to pick a user to center. But if you take a slightly broader aperture and you think of it as being human-centered, Obviously, the resident, the citizen, the user, the form filler is one human involved in understanding their perspectives, understanding how they might interact with a form, interpret a form, complete things is absolutely important. And we can talk more about that. So that was me selecting commercial artists in my earlier example. And digitizing a form and being thoughtful about how to design a form might often start there, but that's just one side of an equation. And a form is often kind of the almost like the membrane between the outside world and the inside of an organization. And the inside of an organization has humans of various sorts, as well as technical systems, processes, and understanding as many of those as possible in order to shape the form such that it is optimal for the people putting things in, and optimal, or at least being intentional about the trade-offs for the people who have to deal with what comes out the other side. So whether that is structuring form fields in a way that fit into the database it needs to fit into is certainly one component of that. But also thinking about the specific needs of the staff who have to make sense of that data, the workflows that those staff have and the teams that are involved, and it's rarely one person or one team, is a really important part of making a form that doesn't just exist and capture information and then lock it up in a way that isn't necessarily helpful. But if you're able to really think about how it's being picked up and how that data is being used, who's using it, in what ways, in what formats, how they're collaborating on it, all of those things impact what might be considered a good form, and can color how you shape that form. And then kind of zooming out even one step further, if you think about a form that is, on the one hand, quick to fill out, and on the other hand, quick and efficient to use the data that comes out of it, you start, as you pull that thread, you start thinking about the systems that can be simplified, the processes that can be shortened, the efficiencies that can be gained, the costs that can be saved. And all of those things are different levels of abstraction, but they're all impacts that process of digitizing or being intentional about a form can have.
Yeah, if I could just have a minute, I certainly, so to give it some context, in California, we have over almost 40 million people. We have 58 counties. So we have our state process, and then we talk about local process, right, at the county level, and then like local, which can be a department or a judge. And so when you digitize, you standardize, right? And for where we sit, there are a lot of benefits. There's one way that you can clearly explain things. There's an opportunity to simplify. You have people with more experience in putting things in simplified language and not using legal jargon. You can think about accessibility from a statewide perspective. We have more resources to translate into multiple languages, for example, although things still have to be submitted in English. And so that is certainly an opportunity, but also, sorry, I have to plug in my, before I die on everyone. But one thing that was talked about is, fitting people into these very rigid boxes, and that can be the trade-off, and thinking about how to design so that we are providing people with the autonomy still and flexibility, and not doing harm. The do no harm motto.
It's such a difficult sort of, it's never as easy as it looks. And for me, as like the career bureaucrat, the form is the single expression of pretty much, you can look at the form now where you can see the different departments, the different processes, the accretion of policies that have sort of somehow culminated in this one form. And it's very hard to disassociate or to distance yourself a little bit. And when you zoom out, you realize the impact on and the cognitive load you've pretty much downloaded. And the more, I guess, the more it's associated with aid that you're asking from the government, the more you're actually downloading, and the more you ask of people, which is quite terrible. And then if the other side of that trade-off is when you're digitizing is sometimes we forget about the other parts of that whole service, like we fixate on the form and the eligibility, and it's really also about what happens at the end. And so meaning if somebody is spending 3 hours completing this form, but it leads to a result within 24 hours, they would like the overall experience is also judged that way. And so if it means that you're paid out in 2 days, would they feel the same at the time? And so there are, and balancing all of those things, and not just, but the form itself is that entry point. And there are so many things that are considered.
I know a lot of people on the panel, especially you, Josh, at the City of Boston, with all of the forms that you've identified, have gone through the process of digitizing forms. And I was wondering if you and anyone else who feel free on the panel could talk about like that process, like how you identified the right forms, like what went into that, building those relationships, like how you looked at tools.
Yeah, good questions. I mean, I think I lucked into a lot of progress. I'll be very, very honest about that. I think identifying, I mean, I literally did start with a spreadsheet that just was a complete scrape of every PDF of the website, and went through that and looked at each one and tried to figure out what it was. I think a lot of times forms, there's very rarely a single repository in any organization, right? I mean, that's the benefit of forms. It's very easy to make one. You can just make one on Microsoft Word and print it out, right? And so, started with that as a database, and then started to just reach out to different departments and work, figuring out that I'm working on that, and then started to uncover more there and there. It helped that my team was doing content work, so they could bring me stuff. I think the main thing to keep in mind when you're trying to digitize forms is, a lot of this is trust building with these various people who do this day-to-day work, right? It's one thing that I think is underrated as government technologists is a lot of the people we talk to on the front lines have met with a lot of smart people like us over the years, and technology has almost never made their lives better, right? There's been a lot of people who have come to them and said, this will be great. And then it was terrible, and it was just the new terrible thing they had to deal with. So, actually making the form, there's a lot of stuff in the technology, and there's a lot of people who will say, oh, there's these great open source form building tools, and there's this and there's that. And like, I could talk about that, but like, that is it took like 30 minutes to make a form, and took me weeks or months in some situations to get a team comfortable with it being online, right? That being said, more of them were excited to do it than I was expecting it to be kicking and screaming, but I think you'll find good partners. But it is, those who view this as a purely technical problem, and a lot of the commercial world, they have these like, they'll come to demo and it'll be like the Adobe Formomatic 10,000. And it's like, you can just suck all your forms in and make them all web responsive in 2 hours and it's done. And it's like, what have you done? Like, all these forms, paper forms are the UI of the previous, non-digital process. So there's this whole backend that needs to occur for so much of this. I was just lucky that a lot of forms can just be that one in, like, submit and do that. And those are mainly the only ones I could get to.
Slight rant, but you reminded me of it from this a meeting I had this morning where somebody had this idea where let's set up some Netflix style thing. You applied for this one benefit, you may also be eligible for all these 4 other ones. And I'm going, really? We're going to inflict 4 extra forms for people to complete instead of actually simplifying that.
That's like so hard to do. Like, yes, I will spend several $1 million on a back-end recommendations engine for, I mean, like, cool. I'd love it for government to work that way, but like, yeah, that's so funny.
Just to jump in a little bit, I think the term digitizing a form is also a misnomer, because the mythical Adobe product you described, Josh, may well in fact correctly digitize a form. Digitizing a form is not the difficult piece, right? Like, you can put a form field. There are bad form fields and good form fields, or good components and bad components. That's essentially a solved problem. The challenge is that as soon as you're digitizing a form, you're opening the Pandora's box of being thoughtful and intentional about what that form should look like, how it should be structured, what it should do, what data should be collected and how. And suddenly you've started pulling a piece of thread that goes deep, deep into an organization. If the task was to digitize a form, this would be a very boring panel. If it's a conversation about making forms fit for purpose in the 21st century for large, complex organizations, that's a messier and more difficult problem that takes a lot more time and to be a lot more, requires people to be more thoughtful in understanding many different perspectives to bring that together that ultimately results in a set of form fields on a website.
The only thing I would just challenge that a little and just advise, I don't know, I'd be curious if you all found this. I mean, one challenge and one thing I'd be really curious about other people's experience. I have found, and this may be more specific to government, that like if you make something not a big deal, people treat it as not a big deal. Like a lot of times when I was moving a form online, be like, well, we don't need these fields. And they're like, well, what if we do? Sure we do. I'm like, well, no, why? We don't need these. And like, why are they there? Well, my boss said they should be there. I'm like, well, when they retired 20 years ago, like whatever. And like, if I said, like, we're going to redesign your form to be more equitable, it would have been like a 20-person meeting where we all talked about it. But when I was able to say, like, here's a draft, it's all here, what do you think? People really were like, this isn't pretty, this is nice, this isn't bad. And the other piece of pushback I would say is one thing that I think I was able to have some success. And I'd be curious where you all draw the line in process change, because I feel like that's a huge part of it, right? Like I had a form that probably they still do this. A resident could fill out a digital form, it would email a PDF, and that person printed it and put it in their wooden inbox. And like, that's horrifying. But at the same time, like, you know, I was delivering some value to residents to fill that out, right? I'd be curious, has anyone else had experience where they had to draw the line on process change? Because otherwise you're digitizing the whole organization.
I know I'm the facilitator, but I can actually jump in on that. And our office at the City of Austin did that process. We did a service design process. And so we started looking at policies because policies were really what was stopping the form from being digitized. It was for the Office of Police Oversight at the City of Austin. And the policy basically said you have to come in person, you have to present your ID, you have to self-identify. And for a lot of people, you know, the office is way up north. There's not really a convenient bus route up there. And, you know, a lot of people were put off by like having to identify themselves, right? To file a complaint against an officer. And so we really had to start with that process. And I think it made the form a lot better, but it also meant that it was, I want to say overall, like a 6-month process. It was a really in-depth process. And I think depending on where you are in your maturity, that can be an issue, right? Because if you're trying to build up a lot of support, you really want to move quickly and fast and get those wins done. But that's my 2 cents. Someone may have other.
I think that's exactly right. There's something, it's interesting, you know, digitizing a form in one person's conversation is undergoing large-scale digital transformation in another person's conversation, but the latter involves several $1 million in consulting fees and a 5 or 10-year plan. And sometimes it can be incredibly powerful to say, it's just a form, and like rhetorically make it small and kind of push an organization or a part of an organization slowly towards the beginning of a slippery slope where like they might find themselves in the 21st century at the end of it. But that process of starting small, starting with a small piece, that doesn't have to be a big deal and doesn't have to be part of a huge, big plan, can actually be a really powerful way to get to the bigger change as you build partnerships, build relationships, one form at a time, rather than trying to get everyone on board before doing anything.
Yeah, awesome. And it sounds like we're talking a lot about sort of those things that make service digitization difficult. It's not the actual building piece. It's those building the relationships. You know, there's a tool. You know, you can bring in talent. It's that organizational resistance sometimes that makes it hard. I was wondering if any of y'all have. I know you'll talk a little bit about that, but if you talk some more. And if you have strategies or things that have worked to sort of get around that or work with that, if anyone on the panel wants to jump in.
I'm happy to. I feel like I just answered a question, so I don't want to monopolize the time. Yeah, I'll say I was very lucky that my dad had been a columnist for the local newspapers for due to sports. So like in Boston City Hall, that was incredibly exciting for a lot of people. So I had instant trust, but I mean, I think a lot of it is listening. You know, I like kind of what I referred to before. So many people have dealt with so many smart, bright-looking people like us, whether they work in government or highly paid consultants, and they, you know, in the best case, they think we're a bit clueless, and in the worst case, they're just going to wait us out till we're gone, like all the rest of them were. And so the only way to get them on board is that listening and trust, and like, what are your pain points, right? We're trying to solve this for people, but we're trying to solve it for you too. And listening and talking for a long time, and just also making decisions. I've found government a diverse place. And if you're like, people ask me, can we even do this? Sure, we can do this. Why not? If there's a problem, it's my fault. Like, and I found that super helpful in conversations with people to bring them along the journey.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I'm wondering, in addition to listening, if there are any other recommendations or lessons that you'd want to share with people, maybe they're in a government somewhere else in the United States or in Canada, who are trying to do this process, like what recommendations you would have for them.
Sure, I can share. And I don't know if this is like way too simplistic for what we're talking about. But for me, what I found helpful in the last couple of years is just really focusing on the public and the end user, right? And our mission to be public servants. And to that end, what we started doing a couple of years ago was just to do presentations on user-centered design, on user testing, on what that is, on readability and accessibility, right? Showing a judge how to do a readability check in a Word document. And a few weeks ago, I really saw this pay off, because in a working group discussion where we're working on drafting a recommendation for forms changes, like, well, what is that, what reading level is that at? Then the judges started to really like, why do we use that language, personal conduct? No one understands what that is. We need to take that out, right? So like, for me, that was very, very like satisfying to see, right? Like, you want the institutional change so that whatever it is, right, whether it's technology or a paper form, that we have that same goal to start with.
Completely agree with that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Maya.
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right. I think the pandemic has also highlighted opportunities or examples of what it means when somebody is in need and you wanted to simplify the process. Like, I think there was at least a very obvious alignment internally in Canada anyway, when it came to changing the policy or being flexible with the policy, and so that you won't hit the limits of changing the design of the form itself when it came to the design of the emergency response benefit, for example, where you needed to, and so typically when you're doling out, or when a government is rolling out a benefit program, the internal rule set is such, and the form is also designed so that you're preventing fraud, and a person who isn't eligible for aid won't receive it. But in this case, the need, and of course it being unprecedented, meant that it needed to actually look at other ways to sort of reconcile some of these things later. And so the risk was sort of meaning, in this case, people were applying, but some of the information will get validated when it's time to file taxes. And so that was the trade-off that was considered, and being willing to actually have the policy person in the room, the program person in the room, and then people alongside the technologist, the content designer, and the service designer to be part of that process is probably the thing that changed the most, because you could see from intention to implementation what difference can be made.
Those are great. Building on those a little bit, I think one trick that is kind of a classic designer trick of, there are many meetings and many conversations and many Word docs being sent back and forth, and many Google Docs with many comments. And sometimes just pausing and saying, all right, we know we don't know enough to get this totally right, but let's just make it tangible. And whether that can mean drawing boxes on a whiteboard in days when being in a room and a whiteboard together was a thing, or whether that means just mocking up a form in Google Forms or Airtable or whatever, making it super duper tangible and be like, so this is a form. Is this the right form? Does this get us what we need? Where can we fix it? Where can we improve it? Who can we share this with to make sure that it meets all the different needs on the inside that are necessary? And that's also a really helpful prerequisite to say, well, now we have this, we might as well just put it in front of a few people and just like see what they think, see how they respond to it. Ideally, obviously, you would put it in front of the types of people who would be using that form for real. And sometimes that can highlight issues, whether that's in structure or language, that you didn't realize beforehand because you're speaking to people who are not like yourself. But in other cases, it can also be a really powerful way to make a point about things that you know to be true, or you as a team know to be true, and make it not just your opinion. So sometimes you can look through a form and say, well, someone's going to get tripped up over there because no one knows what that word means. But that everyone on the inside is like, people know what that means. And suddenly it's your word against theirs. But if you're able to say, well, actually, we put it in front of a bunch of people and like everyone was really excited to put their information in, but then they all got tripped up on question 3. Is there anything we can do to make that easier for them? Suddenly can unblock what can sometimes be resistance to changing something that may have always been that way. And can align everyone around a particular perspective on how a user might react to that form. So making it tangible and then putting it in front of people sounds super simple. Obviously is its own challenge sometimes in government, but it can make a lot of things shift that can be very difficult when you're just saying, no, it's got to change. And it can make it apparent to everybody that change needs to happen without it coming initially from you.
Thanks. We have one last question, and then we ask folks to put their questions in the chat, and we'll take those. Jasmine Latimer, the director of service design at Code for America, recently tweeted, to me, designing truly equitable government means moving closer to proactive, invisible, or automatic service delivery, shifting the burden back to government, resulting in truly equitable outcomes at scale. And so it sounds like maybe potentially there's a new sort of future. And so I kind of want to ask y'all what y'all think the future of forms is, or lack of forms in some cases even, maybe.
You want to call on someone to go first?
Josh.
There's a couple things that I took away. I think a lot of it is a lot of forms, and I found clusters of forms really tend to add up to the UI of an application. And I think a lot of the when I was at Boston, they kept sending me to assessing because assessing had 1 million forms. But when you dug into it, it was like all of those forms were just access this database, get the information from that database, update the information in that database. And so I do think as we get more mature, the conversation is going to be, as the digital services conversation, how are we building these applications, hopefully open source and reusable, that different teams can use. The only other thing is I'm very interested in the idea of form. All of these things are just information passing back and forth, but what is the value to our users in the name? What's a license? What's a form? What's a permit? Those are all the same information to send to someone, but they mean different things. And how does that work? So I don't know. I'm curious about that. I have no idea. Catherine, I don't know. Should I call on someone else to go next on the future of everything?
Honey, Mayo, Francis.
Yeah. Go ahead, Francis.
No, go ahead, honey. I'll go after you.
All right. From a service delivery angle, again, I think about forms as another expression of what it means to deliver at the speed of trust. And so, so that relationship between, government bureaucrats with each other, and then how that sort of transfers and kind of and gets in some ways inflicted onto the public versus or the public sort of feeling invited to it. And I think the more you, I really do believe, maybe naively, but this is about 13, 14 years in, that I think the more improvements and the more responsive you make your service, the more people are inclined, or the more people see that you're actually making an effort to improve, the more open they will be to actually suggest ways to even improve it. And so, and that's how we will get to that state where the form will not need to exist. Or if there is some way or some exchange of information that needs to take place, that's where our, I guess, our way of codifying permissions will be a reflection of that. That sounds probably more philosophical than it is, but at the very least, sort of even the most it will begin with the most transactional service and then kind of cascade to the more complex ones.
Great, thanks, honey. Francis.
Yeah, I think it's to not lose the human side of it. Is forms are communication, right? It's a way in which we're communicating, and I think what we've talked about, what others have also talked about is how a form or how a process makes you feel. it could bring out fear. In the work that I do, I'm thinking about people who've experienced trauma or are in an unsafe situation, right? And of course, I'm dealing with restraining orders, but it could be somebody applying for housing, a housing voucher, or a public benefit, right? And so just making sure that we have those people in mind, people that have the most barriers, are most vulnerable, and really accounting for that in the design.
I agree with what everyone else has said. I think taking a little bit of a different tack on the question. I think the premise that a form is hassle and effort, and that as a end user you don't really want to deal with it, I think is a natural and often true starting point. And so, no form is better than a form in many situations, which just kind of makes me think of Estonia's government has this wonderful policy called the once only policy, where if you've told the government something once, you should never have to tell them again because they should already know it. And the first time that I heard that, I was like, genius. First of all, how the hell did they manage to make that happen? But genius. But that relies on a lot of trust between the person engaging with the government and that organization, that's actually what you want. And although it definitely fits into the kind of user experience, reduce friction kind of philosophy, and it feels very user-centric. I was startled recently when I renewed I have a German passport, and I renewed my German passport at the consulate here in New York. And you fill out some forms, as you do, and you show some documents. And at the bottom of the form, it says in kind of very bureaucratic German, thanks for filling out this form, please sign here that it's all true. We will only use this information for the purposes of renewing your passport, and we will destroy it as soon as it's approved, which is the polar opposite of that once only principle, but is also in its own way very user-centric and human-centered. And it's just kind of an interesting thing to think about as kind of two polar opposites from an experience point of view, both in very different ways, centering the user in different contexts, different cultural contexts, different types of forms. And I think just being conscious that there is no one answer that works for all different forms and for all different types of information that might be gathered through a form. And being really sensitive to that, and being open to the idea that for some forms you want it destroyed the moment it's done. And for other forms, you're like, I never want to think about this again. You know it now, just take care of it for me, are both totally valid responses, and that it can be a very nuanced thing to get an understanding of when you're confronted with the need to redesign or digitize a form.
Great. Thank you all. I think we have time for one or two questions. I know Honey answered this in the chat, but if anyone else has some advice, someone asked, are there resources for organizations that don't have experts like you on staff to navigate diving into process change and evaluating changing a form to fit the purpose? Anyone, best practices that anyone's seen, or organizations that y'all have reached out to?
I don't know if anyone else has opinions on it. I know that maybe you can try to get Denver's Peak Academy and the work they do around service design, I've always thought is really interesting. And I know they will do seminars for other places. I think it costs a little bit of money, but that might be, it's a lot about empowering the people to do the work. And that may be a way to jumpstart the effort without having to have a dedicated service designer or anything like that. I don't know if that's good or bad. It's gone through whether this is a good or a bad thing, but I've tended, everyone I know who's done it has loved it.
I'd also pitch in that I think USDR and 18F are doing some great work. And I know, I don't want to throw y'all out there, but I know that the people on our panel are also experts and, really great people to talk to. So sorry if I volunteered y'all to talk with Dana. And then I think we have one other question. Are the forms you have created providing immediate feedback to the user? So have any of y'all worked on the question or worked on that type of form?
I think.
Nope. Okay.
All right. So we, so on that, in terms of immediate feedback, what we've done and what I've found we've done quite a bit of is actually display the information up front. Most of the time, what we wanted to eliminate was a situation where somebody gets all the way to the end and then realize they were missing something because it becomes a source of frustration. So talking about whether you're eligible to apply in the first place, and then also what documents you need to have beforehand. And so really making changes to the form so that becomes a source of less frustration. And then adding that message in between in terms of, or at the end, sort of what happens once you hit submit, like when do you expect to hear back? And so they know that there's and then also a number for follow-up. That's like those were the ones where the improvements that we've gotten anyway. We would love to be at a state where we would be able to depends on the form, like be able to know based on what they, based on what people have completed, whether they're eligible for a program immediately or not. The same way when you're trying to, I guess if you're applying for a credit card, you almost immediately have that result. But we aren't there yet.
I think the feedback question's a really good one. And it applies at almost every level of altitude or abstraction that you might ask it at. On the whole, more feedback to user input is almost always better. I'm sure there are exceptions, but almost always better. And that applies to everything from like in the form field, like this password's too short, through to like, or like that's not a valid input, or like your phone number is missing a character, through to like you haven't completed everything on this form, through to actually being really thoughtful about what happens after someone hits submit and saying, that might have been a difficult form to complete, like thank you, whether that's emotionally difficult or because it's for some reason technically arduous. And then also just zooming out further, a form is, we've talked a lot today about a form being the tip of an iceberg, or like one small manifestation of a service. And you're really done once you've submitted a form. You're done with that one step. And so being really thoughtful about what kind of feedback happens in the moment, as well as what happens a day later, a week later, a month later, so that someone knows the information they've submitted is in the system, is being processed, is being considered, is accepted, is rejected. Those are all different types of feedback at different timescales and abstractions. And adding them all up is kind of the only way to make sure that someone feels that they haven't thrown something into a black hole that may or may not fit, or thrown something in a black hole that does fit and they'll never know when they hear back. And so guiding someone through that process, even when the form is but a distant memory, is a really powerful way to make sure that people feel that they haven't been lost in the system, and that whatever service they're trying to apply for or engage with still has them in mind and is still thinking about serving them and getting them what they need.
And with that, I think we're at the end of the panel. So thanks to everyone who attended, and especially thank you to the panelists and BetaNYC. Hope everyone has a good day.
Thanks all for coming.